Welcome to our fourth lecture in our series, The Economics of Post-Crisis Recoveries. For those of you who are coming back, you'll notice that I am not Heloise Ardley, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. My name is Petr Sedlacek, and I'm what here in Oxford we like to call the senior tutor for OUBEP, which means that I'm responsible for the academic content that we offer you. Now, let me start by thanking you for taking the time to join us and thanking our sponsors for this series, J. Stern & Co. And before I get to introducing our next speaker, I want to share some really exciting news with you. And that is that OUBEP has just launched a brand new online course called Markets and the Globalized Economy. Now, this course is designed to provide you with a fundamental understanding of economics, both at the individual and business level, but also at the country or international levels. It will be taught by 4 of our top researchers who are also very experienced lecturers. And the course will run from June to September this year. All the lectures are going to be online, on demand, so you can watch them at your convenience. But there's also going to be continuous support from teaching assistants, and there'll be 2 sets of virtual discussion sessions in small groups of about 8 or 10 people. To just give you a short teaser for the types of topics that we'll be covering, we'll touch upon things like the economics of vaccines, or how game theory could help you win in an auction, whether the Biden plan will create inflation, or, for example, what COVID has done to entrepreneurship and what that could mean for the future of innovation and economic growth. So if you're interested, please just check out our website where there's much more information, or simply get in touch with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you all in the summer. Now, let me get back to the reason why we're here today and introduce the next speaker, Tim Willems. It's a great pleasure to introduce Tim. I was lucky enough to study a few of my PhD years with Tim back in Amsterdam at the Timbergen Institute. But then Tim directly went to the University of Oxford. So here in Oxford, we're very happy to call him our own. And despite Tim had, according to his own words, the best 3 years of his life here in Oxford, he decided to move on to the International Monetary Fund, where he currently works at the debt policy division, focusing on debt sustainability and restructuring. Simply put, I think Tim is an excellent economist with a very broad range of expertise, from fiscal and monetary policy to economics of climate change and imperfect information, but also economics of forced experimentation and the power of expectations, and that's why he is here today. So Tim, we have about 45 minutes for your talk. All the participants are on mute, but please bombard Tim with questions through the Q&A function, and I'll pass the questions on during the session, and then hopefully we'll also have a few minutes at the end. If we don't manage to get through all your questions, then just email us or contact us through Twitter or LinkedIn, and we'll continue the conversation there. So Tim, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you very much for having me. Real pleasure to be back in Oxford, albeit only virtually. As Petter mentioned, I'm currently at the IMF, so I have to start out by pointing out that whatever I'll say, it's not the official IMF view. Luckily for me, I'll also be speaking mostly about some research I did prior to joining the IMF. Research mostly actually done in Oxford, which weirdly relates to the situation that we're finding ourselves in today, because you will, of course, all have noticed that we're sadly in the middle, well, hopefully towards the end of a deadly pandemic. And today I'd like to talk you through some of the mechanisms via which our recent experience may affect the recovery path that we seem to be on and the period beyond. And since we might all be at this point in need of some positivity, I'll try to provide an optimistic narrative, but I will also end with some cautionary notes on that such an optimistic narrative is exactly also where the risks lie going forward. So first, whenever an economist is looking to answer what does event X mean for the economy, whatever the economy exactly is, he or she will immediately be inclined to look at the behavior of stocks. After all, a stock is a claim on the future profit of a company, and stock prices are therefore thought to be the best reflection of where future profits are headed. People's money is on the line, so they tend to think carefully about where to put it. However, when you're looking at stock prices, here the S&P 500, the answer seems to be actually that the pandemic, economically speaking, is perhaps not such a big deal. Yes, people were freaking out in March when lockdowns arrived to the Western world, but since then the recovery in stock prices has been very impressive. We're basically back to the pre-pandemic trends. So if you just draw a trend line here prior to the pandemic and simply extend it towards where we are today, then we're basically exactly as if whatever happened in March was just a false alarm and nothing really fundamentally changed afterwards. But we, of course, know that reality is very different. So what's going on? So I think it's sort of a combination of at least four things. So first of all, it's important to point out that stock markets are not representative for the economy in a broader sense. So stock markets tend to only represent the bigger companies and in particular industries. So there are typically no restaurants, no tour guides, no actors, and so forth. And if you were also take them into account, the picture would, of course, look less rosy. Then secondly, with the pandemic, we also all became far more patient in a way. We were forced to save a lot. We suddenly couldn't go out and have a restaurant meal. So instead, savings went up. And an increase in savings tends to depress interest rates. So whenever we discount the future, we essentially became more patient. So we now place more weight. We attach more weight to the distant future. So seen through that lens, a temporary blip in profits, just a 1 year blip in profits, doesn't do that much to their entire present discounted value, which is what a share price is meant to represent. Thirdly, it may also be the case that, as I said before, the stock market mostly represents the bigger companies, and there is a real risk and a real fear that the pandemic may end up increasing market power of these big companies, think Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, going forward. And if that is the case, yes, their future profits might very well go up as a result of the pandemic, but that is at the expense of smaller firms or firms that don't exist yet. So it might also deter new entry. And that's like a negative outcome that might explain why stock prices are currently so high. But that's actually an outcome that we may wish to avoid. And then fourthly, and this will be the main focus of my talk today, is that I do think that there's also some genuine optimism regarding the future. So the vaccines arrived on the scene much quicker than anyone could have expected, and they're far more effective than anyone could have hoped. Policymakers have not been shy at all. So we've learned, in a way, I think it's a blessing that if a pandemic had to come, that it came so quickly, relatively speaking, after the global financial crisis, because that definitely taught policymakers, also at the IMF, that one shouldn't go shy. So it's better, if anything, if you're going to err, it's better to err on the side of caution and do too much rather than too little. So policymakers are not shy in supporting the economy, I think rightfully so. And then point C, which is the main focus of my talk today, which is that there is also a belief that we can use this pandemic to build back better. So there is the idea that the whole working from home experience might enable us to work more efficiently going forward. And there are also maybe reasons to believe that we might see a boost in innovation going forward. But these are going to be the topics of my talk today. So in terms of the outline, first and foremost, of course, it goes without saying that the pandemic has brought much hardship in various forms. Of course, the loss of lives, loss of liberties, long COVID, and these are all undesirable outcomes that are should have been avoided, but we haven't managed to. And given where we are today, then I would also like to simply give some reasons for some optimism, which I think there are good reasons for, because I do strongly believe that it is reasonable to think that the post-pandemic economy will turn out to be more efficient, as I will motivate in the first part of this talk. And then the second part, I would like to end on a cautionary note in terms of like what are the main risks to the post-pandemic recovery. And there I would first and foremost refer back to the previous bullet, in that there might be a dangerous expectations effect whereby we maybe get overly exuberant regarding these efficiency gains post-pandemic, and the future turns out to be less rosy. That could very well set us up for a big crisis. And then, as I said before, I think there's also reasons to be concerned about possible increases in market power going forward. But to start with, I would first like to take you back some 160 years in time and discuss an important methodological approach which empirical researchers love to uncover an important concept in economics and the world more generally, namely the concept of causality, whereby some driving variable X is really causing a change in some other variable Y rather than merely being correlated with it. So those who know London well might recognize this as being the Soho area in London. So over here we see Regent Street. This is Oxford Street. This is called Regent Circus, but I think nowadays we call it Oxford Circus. And here you see Broad Street, which we nowadays call Broadwick Street. And here you see the word pump. Now, what we're looking at here is a famous epidemic which took place 160 years ago in London, namely a cholera epidemic, particularly the one in 1854. So the black squares here are houses which hosted cholera patients, and the maker of this map, the famous physician John Snow, considered to be the founder of modern-day epidemiology. Here we are. So John Snow noticed that all of these houses with cholera patients tended to be in the serving area of this particular pump, which then led him to believe that the pump played some role in the spread of cholera, which took place in Soho in 1854. At that time, the predominant theory was that cholera spread through the air, but John Snow started to suspect that cholera was actually spread through contaminated water. And he famously removed the handle of the pump so that people could no longer use it, and ended the cholera outbreak in that way. So from that point onwards, he was convinced that there was a causal link. But the question was, this was of course already strong evidence, but how did he really nail the case for there to be a causal relationship between drinking contaminated water and the development of cholera? And in order to do so, he decided to look at something that we now call, he looked at the difference in differences. So what does that mean? It turned out that around the same time in London, there was a fortunate experimental situation, a random experiment, not implemented for conscious reasons, but just by sheer luck or sheer chance. There happened to be a situation where until 1852, London was primarily being supplied in terms of like water supply by two water companies, the Vauxhall Water Company and the Lambeth Water Company. And they both sourced their water from the Thames River, which later turned out to be, they didn't realize at the time, but the Thames River was highly contaminated. Then in 1852, for kind of random reasons, Lambeth Company changed its policy and began sourcing water from a different river, the Ditton River, which happened to be much cleaner. Now, what John Snow did is that he started tabulating cholera cases by water supplier and over time. So in this bottom row here, you see that there are this is John Snow's original table, by the way. So you see that there are 4 sub-districts which are being supplied by Lambeth Company. And in 1849, so when the water supplied by Lambeth was still coming from River Thames, there were 162 cholera deaths. But then in 1852, Lambeth Company switched to the Ditton River. And afterwards, in 1854, there were only 37 cholera deaths. But it came down by 75%. Now, in isolation, this is not like definitive evidence for a causal effect. After all, it could also simply be that air quality in London improved between 1849 and 1854. But that is why our comparison group, also called control group, comes in. Because at the same time, we also have 12 sub-districts, which throughout this period continued to be supplied by the Vauxhall Water Company. And throughout this period, the Vauxhall Water Company continued to source its water from the River Thames. And strikingly, the Vauxhall Company, which was breathing the same air, the people living in these sub-districts were basically breathing the same air. The only thing that changed was they stuck with Thames water, and these people switched to water coming from the Ditton River. And while they saw a 75% decrease in cholera cases, the ones who stuck with the River Thames, actually saw an increase in cholera cases. So unless there were other strong differences going on between 1849 and 1854, between these sort of 12 and these 4 sub-districts, which there weren't, this is pretty strong evidence of a causal effect, because basically everything between these districts was the same, except for one thing, and that was that these switched their water supply away from the River Thames to the River Ditton, and they saw a strong decrease in the number of cholera deaths coming down. So that's pretty strong evidence for a causal effect, and the crucial thing to establish that was that treatment was only partial. Only 4 sub-districts were quote unquote treated, which in this case means got their water from somewhere else. But conveniently, we also had a background comparison group which didn't change its water supply. And the presence of this comparison group was actually crucial to establish a causal effect coming from the change in water supply, rather than there being a broader London-wide trend like improvements in air quality. And it is, of course, exactly John Snow's insight that is still being used today when testing the efficacy of vaccines or other medication, which also works for the treatment and the control group. In that case, we do it by design. In this case, it just happened by chance that some people were treated for random reasons. They switched water supply at people at the Lambeth Water Company, and others didn't. But the key insight is the same. Now, let's fast forward 160 years, but let's stay in London. And on February 5 and 6 in the year 2014, you would then find chaos on the streets of London. It was a rainy day, and to make matters worse, employees at Transport for London, the company running the London Underground, also known as the Tube, decided to go on strike. Now, again, by sort of random reasons, the strike was only partial. So some tube stations remained open and in service, but other tube stations closed down. Now, this meant that in a way there was disruption for everybody, because the whole operating system became more crowded because capacity was reduced. But disruption was more severe for some commuters relative to others. In particular, if you were a commuter who always used to travel from station A to station B, and station B closed down as part of your strike, you were forced to experiment. So you had to try out a new route. So that's what we would call the treated commuters. So the treated commuters are those whose either station of entry or station of exit closed down as a result of the strike, and thus had to try out either a new entry station, a new exit station, or something new altogether. Other commuters, on the other hand, for them, their station of entry and station of exit did not close down, so they could simply travel from A to B as they had always done. And for them, not that much changed. It was just a little more crowded, but they were less likely to try out something new. So what I ended up asking, together with two co-authors, Sean Larkham, who's at Cambridge, and Ferdinand Rauch, who is also at Oxford, we ended up asking, well, did this sort of 2-day disruption, did it have any lasting effects on people's commuting behavior after the strike was over? And if so, what does this mean for human nature, I would almost say. So what you see here is a visual representation of the map. So this is a map of London, this is the aforementioned Thames River, and all the circles and crosses are tube stations. The only thing is that the crossed out tube stations are the tube stations that closed down during those two strike dates. So you see that about 40% of all stations remained open. So it was very well possible to experiment within the network. So maybe Chancery Lane tube station closed down, but Holborn, the next tube station, or St. Paul's remained open. So if you were always traveling to Chancery Lane, you just had to get off one stop earlier, or maybe stay on the underground for one stop longer. And moreover, conveniently for us, both days happened to be rather rainy, so the weather was pretty bad, but not that many people actually switched to walking or cycling, meaning that most commuters continued to show up in our data, which came from the London transport company, Transport for London. And what we ended up finding, strikingly, was that commuters whose normal journey was closed down during the strike, which we call the treated commuters, they were less likely to return to their old commute after the strike was over, relative to, again, this control group of people who were not treated, so could still travel from their habitual station A to their habitual station B. So those who were forced to experiment, those who had always been traveling from A to B, but then B closed down, so they had to try out A to C for one day, they ended up finding a route that after the strike was over, they apparently considered superior to whatever they'd been doing before. And this was only as a result of like 2-day experimentation. And the way in which the new route was superior could either be that it was more convenient, that it was more quiet, that it had a convenient shop along the way, close to the exit station. And in the data, we actually also found that it was quicker. So on average, treated commuters managed to reduce their commute by a whole minute. So as a result of that, and even if you take into account that the strike did bring 2-day chaos and disruption, which we sort of tried to quantify in the paper, if you then look at the costs incurred during this 2-day disruption period and weigh them up against the present discounted value of all benefits, which was a superior commute, a shorter commute by 1 minute, and maybe some of these other gains which are more difficult to quantify, we find that, well, there are both gains at the individual level. So people did better after the strike, and also the entire network operated more efficiently after the strike because people were spending less time in the network. They'd found a quicker, a shorter route. So what's going on here? Why were these people not optimizing before? Why did it take an external tube strike for them to simply get off one station earlier or later, or try a different connection or a different line altogether? Why didn't they do this before? And because they could have experimented voluntarily, right? Nobody forced them always to take the same route before the strike happened. So why didn't they experiment voluntarily? Well, there we find some pretty striking evidence that the mechanism seems to run through informational imperfections. So what I never properly realized when I was living in London is that travel times are actually quite heterogeneous across different lines. So there are some lines which have traveled at a much higher speed than other lines. So if you just look at the tube map, which I'll come back to in a second, but if you look at the tube map and just try to eyeball the shortest route between 2 points, you're likely to get it wrong because the tube map is not informative about the average speed at which the trains travel. So what we ended up finding is that people who were traveling on lines that were relatively slow, those people were more likely to stick to their newly found route after the strike, and those people were also more likely to make time savings because they were now maybe forced to try out a different line altogether. So they were always traveling on the red line, and now they were forced to swap onto the blue line. And then they actually found out that, hey, the blue line's actually much more quicker. So even though maybe it's a longer route, it saves me time. Secondly, of course, as you will all know, the London tube map is quite distorted. So that's what you see here. You see the famous London tube map here. But here you actually see what it really looks like when you draw it on an actual map that is not stylized. So you can actually quantify the distortion in the tube map. And what we ended up finding is that people who traveled to or traveled from areas where the tube map was very distorted relative to the true reality of things, those people who either came from or traveled to very distorted areas, they were more likely to find a superior route during the strike. And the time savings that those people made were stronger than the time savings made by other people who by chance were traveling to or from areas that were less distorted. So our interpretation of this evidence is that people had simply failed to find their optimal route before the strike. They weren't at the true optimum. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that these people were not rational. I don't want to criticize the rationality of London commuters, because in particular, when search is costly and when there are costs involved with trying out something new, it might at some point be the case that the search or the experimentation costs, which you have to incur with certainty when trying out something new, simply do not weigh up against the expected benefits to experimentation, which are moreover uncertain. So when search is costly, it can very well be optimal not to find the maximum. However, with some models, you can calculate actually, so we were able to really analyze the behavior of London commuters in a quite detailed way using information coming from Oyster cards. So when you calculate the implied search costs that can rationalize this behavior, they would have been very, very large. And particularly, you would have had to offer a commuter £36 to induce them to switch to the next best alternative route. So basically, you'd have to offer them £36 in order for them to get out a station later or a station earlier than they were normally doing, which just strikes for only one time, which is just, I think, far greater than what we believe is reasonable to ask them to do so. So instead, what seems to be going on is that people were not fully rational, and instead they were maybe reasoning in a more rule of thumb type way, which a famous economist called Herb Simon, he called this behavior satisficing. So you're not fully maybe, not at the not maybe fully optimizing, but at some point you reach a satisfactory situation which you try to settle for. So at this point, so this might be, so what commuters were doing is that they had maybe experimented a little bit and sort of settled on this point here and found this a satisfactory outcome for them, and they simply didn't want to like even think about the possibility that they could do something else. But then, because a strike suddenly rendered this outcome no longer possible, they were forced into this part of the map, and then they realized that, hey, previously I was at this local maximum, but it actually turns out that there's a far better point to be at. The true global maximum is maybe here. So it was only because of a routine-breaking disruption that they were able to get out of the place where they previously got stuck, and explore a new part of the world where it actually turned out that there was a far greater, a far better outcome out there available. And this goes back to like a saying which is often attributed to Plato, but he never really said it in that way. But which is that necessity is the mother of invention. That a need or problem encourages creative efforts to solve the problem. So it does seem that there is a true link between disruptions and innovations. And when you sort of think of it, I think there are at least four possible mechanisms. So the one that the tube strike example really talks to is that of habit disruption. So in that case, a shock may force an agent out of a suboptimal routine, which then suddenly wakes them up and makes them realize that an alternative is actually far superior. So there's the London Underground example, but there's also an interesting example of where victims of an Icelandic volcano in the 70s, a volcano in Iceland erupted, as they occasionally do over there. And as a result of that, some people had to move out of their houses and moved into cities. And when we traced down those people 40, 50 odd years later, it actually turned out that they are happier, they are richer than those people who did not move. So it seems that in this case, the disruption again managed to force people out of their habit, out of their comfort zone. But then 50 years later, it actually turns out that they're doing much better than the people who actually stayed behind. Secondly, what may also be going on is that there's a weakening of path dependence. So in many cases, in reality, outcomes are path dependent for like no good reason. And an exogenous shock is needed to give people a chance to think, a chance to reform, a chance to overcome barriers stemming from fixed costs. And in many cases, I think that the fixed costs are of a psychological nature. For example, the collapse of the Roman Empire around the year 1000, the collapse of the Roman Empire, for example, led to a stronger de-urbanization in Britain than it did in France. So in Britain, sort of many cities kind of collapsed as a result of the collapse of the Roman Empire, but in France, for some reason, they didn't. But as a result, when we're now 1,000 years further in time, French cities are actually kind of stuck in suboptimal locations that were determined for reasons a long, long time ago, even before Christ, reasons that are no longer relevant. Britain, on the other hand, was able to enjoy a reset in a way, enabling them to relocate their cities to places that are more adapted to changed circumstances. In particular, the arrival of shipping-based trade. So as a result, Britain's modern urban network has far better coastal access to this very day, of course, than France has, of course, correcting for the fact that Britain is an island. But before the collapse of the Roman Empire, Britain had a very different urban network, with far less connections to the coast than it has today. And France, even today, has a suboptimal network that does not have good access to the coast. But France is kind of stuck. It's kind of stuck in this suboptimal situation that was determined for reasons that are no longer relevant, and for reasons that were determined 1,000 years ago. Similarly, I was in touch with Martin Ellison yesterday, and he pointed out to me, Martin Ellison, who gave the previous lecture in this series, and he pointed out to me that the UK's vaccine policy, which was driven by limited supply, whereby they ended up delaying the second dose, it actually now turns out to seem to work better than the original recommendation of spacing between the two doses of vaccines of only 6 weeks, think the UK has stretched it out to 12 weeks. But that decision was purely made by supply-related reasons. But it now turns out that actually the 6-week recommendation was never a dimension that AstraZeneca and the Oxford Jenner Institute optimized along. So it actually seems out to be the case that this vaccine-driven policy, which was purely made for different reasons, having to do with limited supply, now actually seems to be superior. So again, there were some fixed costs, maybe of a psychological nature, that made people, even to this day in many other countries, hesitant to experiment a little bit and delay the second dose. But by now, the first evidence seems to suggest that delaying the second dose may actually give better protection. So again, something that we learned for rather random reasons. Similarly, a big disruption may also help to overcome coordination failures. So, for example, if I invest and upgrade my home, that creates positive spillovers to the homes of my neighbors. I myself, for example, always prefer to live on the ugly side of the road, since I then get to enjoy a better view. A reasoning that a friend of mine always attributes to Carl Pilkington, if you know who that is, who always tends to be of the same reason. But in people, so on the one hand, there's the view aspect. On the other hand, if people do end up upgrading their home, it might also attract neighbors with a higher income, for example, which also then upgrades the neighborhood. So there are all kinds of these kind of coordination spillovers. But if I upgrade my home, and as a result of that, I end up improving the neighborhood because of other people getting to enjoy a better view or improved quality of the neighborhood in general, I personally am not being compensated for that. So my investment that I incur 100% myself also generates spillovers to other people that I am not able to capture back. So in normal times, this will lead to an outcome where I invest too little in my own home because I don't take the spillovers, the positive spillovers to other people into account. So unless I know that my neighbors will reciprocate and return the favor and upgrade their home as well, we will typically end up in an equilibrium where there's underinvestment. Now, in Boston, there was a big fire in 1872, which ended up destroying a lot of houses in that area, and as a result of that, the entire city actually needed to be reconstructed at the same time. And because now suddenly the game was simultaneous rather than sequential, residents were suddenly able to coordinate jointly on an equilibrium in which everybody invested a little bit more in their house because they saw that the neighbor was doing it as well, thus overcoming this holdup problem and making the post-fire equilibrium suddenly more pleasant to live in for everybody. So again, big disruption was needed in order to allow a market to settle at a superior point. And then finally, a big disruption may also come with a positive selection effect, whereby survival of the fittest leads to increased performance. So, for example, the emergence of China as a major exporter on the world scene bankrupted many weaker firms in other countries, but that actually freed up resources, and those resources were then allocated more productively, leaving the initially hurt economy better off in the longer run. Maybe maybe this is a natural point to pause for a second, Petter, if there are any questions so far.
Yeah, thanks. That's really good. Yeah, there's a couple of questions. One is kind of a clarification question, I think. Mm-hmm. So when you were talking about the research you've done about the London Tube, you mentioned that those commuters who were forced to experiment were then less likely to return to their old route. Does this mean that even the people who actually weren't forced to experiment did so, that they, for instance, didn't realize that their station didn't actually shut down? So is that an indication of the information imperfections that you were talking about?
Could you? So I'm not sure I understand the second part of the question.
So so it sounded like there were cases of people who didn't have to change their route but did so anyway during the strike. Is that something that you observed?
A little bit. So there was a little bit of maybe voluntary experimentation going on, and you always have some turnovers. You always have some people randomly changing their routes in normal times even. So that continues to happen. But we did find a very marked difference between those who were forced to experiment and their post-strike behavior, and those who did not. So it really seemed that the force that was instilled upon them made them sort of woke them up and made them realize that they had been doing something suboptimal for many years in all likelihood. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then maybe one more before I let you continue. So there's a question whether you have any information on how the untreated group of people fared afterwards, whether they were worse or better off because now maybe they had the treated commuters making their particular line more busy or less busy. So do you know anything about perhaps these spillovers to the untreated commuters?
Yeah, so indeed there will be some heterogeneity in that some lines that were maybe underutilized became busier. So if you happen to be on an underutilized line before the strike, you sort of lost, but at the other, someone who was on the competing line that was too crowded before the strike and it sort of the level of crowdedness came down, you won. But on average, even the people who didn't change did benefit because the whole network operated more efficiently. So there was less pressure on the network because at the individual level, everyone on average shaved a minute off their commuting time. So if you multiply that by a couple of million people, the pressure on the entire network simply came down a little. And that's something from which everybody should have. So the allocation of people to different lines, post strikes, was more efficient. And that's something from which everybody will have benefited a little bit.
Okay, excellent. Thanks. I'll let you go. We've got about 15 minutes left.
Okay. So when asking what impact pandemic disruptions have on innovation, we do, of course, have an important earlier example, namely that of the Spanish flu. And for that one, we actually have decent city-level data for the US, where researchers have established that cities undergoing stronger lockdowns actually saw an increase in patenting rates after the pandemic ended, where the causal impact is estimated to have been some 10%. Now, the exact mechanism is unclear, but there is one famous story on the telephone. So the Spanish flu massively spurred the adoption of the telephone because that was the only way in which people could keep in touch with each other in a safe way. So that became the telephone became so popular that it actually the network broke down because at the same time there were flu-infected operators who were manually operating the switchboard. But that then led to the invention of the flip-flop circuit, which replaced these operators and made the whole system more resilient. And the flip-flop circuit is actually what we all use at this moment with the RAM memory, the random access memory. So there's a very clear example of the Spanish flu pandemic bringing about a very important innovation. Now, in terms of applying the COVID sort of lessons generalizing these disruption and innovation lessons to the COVID situation, I think mostly that any future potential will come from the combination of teleworking and maybe some creative destruction. So the disruption has clearly been suboptimally long and accompanied by devastating health outcomes, which shouldn't have been necessary. But still, people are noticing that it does seem to have a positive spillover on innovation. So McKinsey's, for example, famously quoted that we've seen 3 years worth of innovation in just 3 months of pandemic. That was their conclusion last summer. And when we look back upon this period, maybe in 10 years from now, I do think we may very, very well include that this marks the real advent of the new economy and the death of distance, whereby fixed costs, be they either financial or psychological in nature, have now been overcome. So many people believe that the true fruits of the internet revolution have not yet shown up in productivity statistics. And maybe this is sort of the final bump that we need to for those hurdles to be overcome. And this is actually a pattern that we've seen many times before with many other very big general purpose technologies, whereby they only show up in productivity statistics with a very long delay. Electricity, for example, arrived in the 1800s, but the productivity gains only started showing in the 1920s because entire factories and production lines had to be reorganized, which was only profitable to do so after the previous capital stock had been depreciated. So, coming back to this pandemic, it seems that it has brought us to realize that teleworking can be much more pleasant than we would have thought. So most people, when you ask them, studied by Nick Bloom and co-authors, when you ask them how have your perceptions about teleworking changed, substantially improved for the majority of people. They also report that work from home productivity is pretty much the same, a slight increased number of people even reports to be more efficient, but more importantly, while productivity per hour remains the same, we have been able to cut down a massive amount of time wasted on commuting, meaning that we can now work more hours while still enjoying more hours of leisure time as well. So when you ask people, how do you feel about working from home 2 to 3 days a week going forward, people seem to like that idea, and they value it equivalently to about a 6.5% increase in their wage rate. So it does seem that people do seem to value working from home, and this, of course, has a huge potential to increase productivity and well-being. It increases our flexibility. It provides us with new options, which is always good. We don't necessarily have to take them, but we can use them. It's less money wasted and time wasted on commuting. Workers can live in cheaper places, less tied to their work location. Companies, in turn, can save on office-related expenses and business travel. There's a greater potential for outsourcing, and people seem to be healthier and happier when living when working more at home. At the same time, there may also be some survival of the fittest going on, in that large disruptions like the COVID one could end up spurring future productivity growth by so-called shaking of the tree, so putting less productive firms out of business. So that's an idea going back to Schumpeter, we call it creative destruction. But in many countries, actually, the year 2020 brought a record low number of bankruptcies. So 2020 saw 15% reduction in bankruptcies globally, but that's mostly on the back of generous support packages, meaning that the outlook for 2021, when these support packages end and reality sort of kicks in, may very well end up be rather different, and we will see a catch-up in bankruptcies going forward. But as said before, this might actually lead to the putting out of business of some less productive firms, leading to a more efficient reallocation of resources, and COVID might well do something similar. So even though there will be a painful transitory period, in the longer run, we might end up being better off. So this is sort of the optimistic part of the talk. I would like to end briefly on giving some words of caution. So as said before, I do think there are reasons that the post-pandemic economy will be more efficient work practices, some creative destruction, so survival of the fittest and better allocation of resources. But I do think there are two main risks. The first one goes back to my previous point, so I'm contradicting myself here, and that there is a dangerous expectations effect, that if we're going to count on these productivity improvements to arrive, that sets us up for future trouble. And then secondly, it may also be the case that it increases market power. That's actually the topic of a recent IMF study, noting that particularly small and medium enterprises are thought to be particularly vulnerable to going bankrupt post-pandemic. And as said before, this could explain why stock prices, which are by definition mostly of larger firms, have remained so high. And rising market power, while the pandemic in itself might bring some helpful creative destruction, rising market power itself actually works in the opposite direction, making it more difficult for new firms to enter and reducing incentives for incumbents to innovate. So here we will have to see an important role for competition authorities, with the question being, can they really also deal effectively with online market power, which is a very different animal from the standard forms of market power that we've seen before the arrival of the internet age. Then finally, the second word of caution, I think, is that we should be careful not to become overly optimistic. Overly optimistic expectations often sow the seeds for a future crisis, particularly through the overaccumulation of debt. This goes back to ideas of two famous economists, Hyman Minsky and Irving Fisher. Irving Fisher, who in 1933 wrote that overconfidence seldom ever does any great harm, except when it leads victims into debt. And this quote might very well be inspired by his earlier experience, because in 1929, only 9 days before the great crash of Wall Street back then, he famously stated that stock prices have reached a permanently high plateau. So exactly displaying the overconfidence that subsequently also got he himself into great trouble. So when the outlook is rosy, when people do feel that the future will be brighter, there's of course a demand by both individuals and governments to bring these gains forward, which is done through borrowing. But high levels of credit, high levels of borrowing lead to a very fragile equilibrium where if the rosy scenario subsequently fails to materialize, it may set up the world for a very bad crisis to materialize. So let me, in the interest of time here, I unfortunately have to skip some slides on some other methodological issues. But basically, in some other research of mine, together with Paul Beaudry, is what we claim to find is a causal effect, whereby more optimistic expectations, more optimistic IMF growth forecasts were more likely to lead to economic difficulties, in particular recessions and fiscal crises going forward. So it doesn't indeed seem that if countries are counting on future gains to materialize, for example, Greece in the early 2000s, there was this belief that Greece would converge to other Northern European EU members, Eurozone members like Germany. Greece in the early 2000s was able to borrow at similar rates as Germany did, so the Greek government massively overborrowed. And then when it turned out that they had actually been rigging with some statistics, and this convergence process was not taking place as originally planned, Greek's debt stock proved highly unsustainable, and a big crisis in Greece followed. So that's sort of an outcome that we need to guard ourselves against in this particular situation. Still, these words of caution notwithstanding, I would like to finish on a positive note, which is that I really believe that in the long run, the current crisis may well make the world better off. Particularly future generations will get to benefit from this, of course, because they don't have to live through this unpleasant period. But going forward, we'll probably see more focus and due attention being paid to public health and hygiene measures. These mRNA vaccines have massive potential. They've recently also booked some successes on the HIV vaccine front. The Oxford Jenner Institute, the one that developed the AstraZeneca vaccines, now also reporting fruitful efforts regarding a malaria vaccine. BioNTech, the German company that teamed up with Pfizer, is thinking about and sees potential for future cancer treatments. But apart from the health benefits that in the longer run that this pandemic may bring, we will also, I do think, see more efficient work-life practices going forward, just like those tube strikers, those people who suffer from the tube strike, suffering from a 2-day disruption, enjoying a more convenient route to work going forward. After this pandemic, maybe this whole commuting business will become less important to begin with. So that could be another silver lining. But importantly, and that's sort of my main message for today, a deadly pandemic should not have been necessary to achieve this. In particular, we just seem to under-experiment in normal times. So given that we seem to under-experiment, I would say go out there and try something new. Eleanor Roosevelt's famous quote, "When is the last time you did something for the first time?" And when life does get in your way and you do face your favorite tube line closing down, don't be too frustrated, because whatever blockage is causing it, I doubt that you were at your global optimum beforehand. So do embrace the occasional disruption and try to make the most of it, and be reassured that I do think that it's unlikely that you are optimizing beforehand. So you might very well get out better than how you entered the situation. So that's where I would like to end today.
Excellent, Tim. Thanks a lot. We have